Hello and welcome to Frank Philosophy, where we speak frankly about philosophy. I'm your host, Frank, a philosopher. But what exactly is philosophy? Well, to be frank, my preferred definition is that philosophy is pretty much just whatever philosophers say it is. And a philosopher is just anyone who's spent a significant amount of time studying philosophy, most of whom nowadays are in philosophy departments at universities all over the world. We can call this the institutional definition of philosophy. So is that it? Are we done here? No. As a definition, this isn't great. It's circular, and it's not very informative. But it does work as a useful jumping off point for learning more about what philosophy is. Today, we'll take a look at how we got here and where to go next in trying to answer the question, what is philosophy? Now, before exploring the definition that I started with, let's see some common answers to the question of what is philosophy. The word philosophy comes from the ancient Greek words philos, meaning love, and sophos, meaning wisdom. So a general way of understanding philosophy is as the love of wisdom. But that doesn't really get us very far as a definition, since there are lots of easy counterexamples we can come up with to break this definition. All you have to do is find a philosopher who is not a lover of wisdom, plenty of those in academic philosophy, or a lover of wisdom who is not a philosopher, maybe the Pope or an economist. These examples show that the lover of wisdom definition is both too wide, meaning that it includes things that it shouldn't, and too narrow, meaning that it excludes things that it shouldn't. So we can definitely do better. It's often said that philosophy is the study of life's most fundamental questions. That sounds nice, but again, it's the sort of definition that might be too wide and too narrow. Physicists, astronomers, and all sorts of scientists studying the Big Bang, or paleontologists studying the history of life on our planet and human evolution, surely consider themselves to be studying some of life's most fundamental questions, like where did everything come from, or how did we get here? But I'm willing to bet that most scientists wouldn't consider themselves to be philosophers, and most philosophers would probably return the sentiment. So this definition might also include too much, and at the same time, it might exclude philosophers who are focused on questions that might not meet the standard of life's most fundamental, like people working on highly specialized topics in philosophy, like affordances or compositionality. These are certainly philosophical questions. Philosophers spend a lot of time studying them, but are they really fundamental? And what does that even mean? If we're trying to define philosophy by appealing to an abstract term that also needs defining, well, we've just doubled our workload, and nobody wants that. So maybe we've been going about this the wrong way. So far, we've been trying to give a definition of philosophy by looking for the meaning of philosophy. But each time we've run into counterexamples of things that either don't count as philosophy but probably should, and things that count as philosophy on this definition that probably shouldn't. What if instead we just started by defining philosophy by looking around at all the stuff that most likely counts as philosophy, and then trying to see what it all has in common? Philosophers call this a reporting definition, meaning a definition of the term's everyday usage that can then hopefully lead us to a better sense of the word or concept. So what does philosophy typically refer to? Well, it definitely refers to the academic work carried out by philosophers and their students working in philosophy departments. And the work that philosophers do tends to include things like, reading, writing, sharing research, and teaching books and academic articles that have to do with philosophy. They don't do experiments or collect data. Instead, they do information processing about various philosophical topics. And here's the key question to answer now. What are these philosophical topics studied in academic philosophy departments? If we can identify a representative enough sample, we might be able to figure out what all these questions and topics have in common that make them philosophical, beyond the fact that they just so happen to all be studied in philosophy departments. So here are some philosophical topics. Epistemology, or the study of knowledge as such. Logic, or the study of reasoning and the relationships between propositions. Ethics and moral philosophy, or the study of theories of right and wrong. Metaphysics, or the study of the fundamental nature of reality. and political philosophy, or the study of how best to organize society. Now, one thing I can say about these topics is that they're all very old. They all go all the way back to Plato in ancient Greece, Confucius in ancient China, and the Buddha in ancient India. They're what we might call core philosophical topics, and they admittedly have to do with some stubborn and fundamental questions that are still pursued and pondered by philosophers today. Some topics have emerged more recently due to other developments within philosophy and within society at large, like the philosophy of technology, comparative philosophy, or the philosophy of artificial intelligence. These areas of philosophical inquiry didn't really exist until the last century or so, but they're every bit as philosophical as the core topics. It's also worth noting that some topics have fallen off the list. In the past, for example, philosophers had to make a lot more time in their days for studying the philosophy of religion, specifically philosophical issues concerning how to understand religious, usually Christian, doctrines, like whether or not God exists. Philosophy of religion still exists today, but a lot of the discussions that used to take place there now take place in seminaries and theology departments. And science itself was once called natural philosophy, with some of the most important scientific advancements of the European Enlightenment being associated with philosophers like René Descartes or Francis Bacon. So some questions that used to seem unanswerable have indeed been answered, and as a result, they stopped being philosophy. So what do all these topics have in common? Well, for one thing, they seem to be topics that resist a final answer, at least the ones that are still left. They're stubborn, and while some issues have disappeared with time, they're more the exception than the rule. And the new topics that have emerged seem also to resist final answers. But that's still pretty general, and again, this might include too much. Many fundamental questions in science seem to resist a final answer too. So we'll need to do some more work to figure out what makes all these topics in philosophy actually philosophical. We'll have to analyze what these topics have in common and come up with a list of features that they all share, and doing that will probably get us a definition of philosophy that works. But even that might not give us a final answer, since we'll most likely still be able to poke holes in whatever definition we come up with, especially when we take into account that philosophers themselves disagree about what counts as real philosophy. That's a whole other issue. So maybe we won't ever really be able to define philosophy once and for all. But hey, we've made a lot of progress already. Because even if we don't, or maybe even can't, give a clear definition of philosophy, at least we know where to look for the answer. And that's major progress. And very often, philosophical work is just like this. We start with a concept, or a theory, and do our best to make sure that we're asking the right questions about it and looking for answers in the right places, even if we can't ultimately find them. Philosophers definitely do that. In fact, maybe we can even define philosophy based on how it works rather than what it studies. We can define philosophy in terms of the methods that it uses, like argument analysis or conceptual analysis. Philosophers spend a lot of time doing what we might call conceptual analysis on concepts that we can't fully explore all that effectively with scientific methods. Moral concepts like trust or goodness, and abstract concepts like time or consciousness. Philosophers try to offer accounts of these concepts and fully explain their usage by using a method much like the one we use today, to identify some uncontroversial instances of a concept, love or philosophy, for example, and then try to figure out what all those instances have in common that make them what they are. So maybe philosophy is more a method of inquiry rather than a list of topics. But still, this might not satisfy all the philosophers, and philosophical methods vary just as much as philosophical topics, even if there does seem to be some respect in which they all overlap. Okay, so even if I couldn't tell you with any confidence what exactly philosophy is, I hope you have a better sense of what it takes to find the answer. In the meantime, I like to lean on the institutional definition that philosophy is just the philosophical investigation of whatever topics the philosophers seem to agree are sufficiently philosophical. It's circular and it's imprecise, but hey, some concepts are just fuzzy, and that's all there is to it. Thanks for watching. But what do you think philosophy is? How would you go about trying to define philosophy? What do you think all philosophical topics have in common? Let me know in the comments below. And if you like this video, subscribe for more Frank Philosophy.